Hello and welcome to another of PAVE's weekly virtual panels. My name is Ed Niedermeyer. I am the communications director here at Partners for Automated Vehicle Education. And I'm very glad you're with us today for a conversation I've been looking forward to for a little while now. And the basic idea around this conversation has to do with the relationship between cities and the way we get around them. For most of the last 100 years, American cities have kind of been more sort of needing to fit around the needs of cars rather than having the mobility systems sort of fitting to the needs of the cities. And today's question really is, is there an opportunity for AVs to reverse that relationship to some extent? And if so, what might that look like? We've got three just really incredibly engaged and well-informed and thoughtful people here to share their views on this this really interesting topic today. First up, from INRIX, a PAVE member, we have Avery Ash. He's the head of global public policy. Avery, welcome back.
Thank you.
Also returning to our weekly virtual panel series, from Nuro, we have public policy manager Greg Rogers. Greg, again, welcome back.
Great to be here. Thanks, Ed.
And last but far from least, from New York University, we have the Associate Director of the Rudin Center for Transportation, Sarah Kaufman, in her first appearance on a PAVE weekly virtual panel. Sarah, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So Sarah, I wanted to actually start with you and just kind of frame this discussion. You know, cities are your focus, and obviously how we get around them is a really fundamental part of that. Can you just explain a little bit what is historically the relationship between urban development and personal mobility, specifically in American cities, and sort of how the car has sort of shaped that?
Sure. So American cities were originally, the older cities, especially on the East Coast, were built around pedestrians and then eventually bicycles and horse travel. And then unfortunately, horses led to a public health concern of large piles of excrement. And so when the car came around, you didn't think I'd work in excrement into the first minute or so, but here we are.
Bingo. Yep.
When cars came around, they were seen as a much cleaner solution for getting around cities, although they were not very safe. But they were seen as the next revolution. Now we've reached a new inflection point where there are a lot of cities questioning and actively pursuing alternative models where the car is not king in downtowns anymore. And so now that we have a menu of alternative mobility solutions, bikes, scooters, one wheels, everything, there's so many options for so many differently traveling people and differently abled people that in dense downtowns, there is less of a need for cars. And so there's a movement against it now. I do think that we still have yet to see the impact of COVID on movement around our cities. And I'm sure my co-panelists can speak more to that as well. But I'm curious to see what the permanent changes will be in this moment of increased car usage amidst the reclamation of space by city residents that's happening now.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I want to sit with you just, I want to dig a little bit deeper into one part of it. Sort of, what is it about the sort of form factor of cars, or like the physical reality of cars that makes them sort of less than optimal, to a dense sort of livable sort of city core, which I think is sort of the ideal you're going for, yeah.
Sure. So cars tend to be these large, 3,000-pound vehicles that are usually not the right size vehicle for the job. If it's a single person commuting, they don't need a 6-seater SUV to go to their work and then sit in a parking garage all day. But they might need a bicycle. But at the same time, someone who works in, say, plumbing might need a rather large vehicle to carry supplies around. So what we need to do is figure out a way to match cars to their match the car to the job, match the vehicle to the job, which really brings into question car ownership, where traditionally people have purchased the vehicle that is the largest possible use they could ever need. And we need to rethink how we get around and how we move our things around. And right now, cars are not the best way to get around. I think everyone can agree that the model of one person, one vehicle in a downtown at all times is not the right way to go.
Yeah. Yeah, just in terms of when you think of density and you think of things being bigger than they need to be, and then, you know, congestion getting worse and all of that. Okay, so, and actually, I'm really glad, Avery, I want to bring you in here. I'm really glad Sarah actually mentioned excrement already in this conversation, because I think it's a really good way.
How dare you, Ed? How dare you? Yeah.
We're here to have you discuss excrement. No, seriously, you know, people I think forget often that sort of horse excrement and dead horse bodies and things like that, that was really in a lot of ways the problem that was staring people in the face when cars came around. And you know, obviously so anxious to solve that problem that people weren't thinking and talking necessarily about what problems are we creating, you know, that might have let people anticipate the congestion and pollution and other kinds of challenges that now we see. Those are the problems staring us in the face. You know, you at INRIX, you work with a lot of data in cities and traffic data in cities. And so I wanted to ask you sort of, you know, what can we learn from this huge amount of data that we have about how cities work sort of as a system? What are the lessons that we can be learning from that? And sort of, are things getting better or worse? Just what is the data telling us about sort of the challenges we face now and how we might be able to solve them?
Yeah, and we can learn a lot. I mean, I think what we have seen over the decade plus that we've been working with DOTs is helping pull back the curtain on where and how vehicles are moving, whether that's real time or historical, lets you make better decisions or more informed decisions. You know, historically, the methodology for collecting this sort of data for understanding what happens across the road network is limited to either sending somebody out in the field to collect data, installing hard infrastructure to count at with a very limited scope. So at this intersection or at this crossing or on this road, or relying on kind of squeaky wheel gets the grease constituent comments of, I think this, I think we need a stop sign at this intersection, or I'm worried about vehicles going too quickly on my street. What we've been able to do is democratize some of that access to data and provide insights across the entirety of a road network that don't tell you what to do, but at least let you understand what the state of play is, and then respond accordingly with the sort of tactical urbanism that I think is more effective at driving outcomes that stakeholders care about. And those outcomes can vary dramatically across regions or cities or stakeholder groups. Kind of what are we seeing now? Are things improving or are they getting worse? Kind of depends what perspective you're looking at this from. Sarah, you brought up COVID. We've done a lot of work around the impact on COVID on our road networks. So we put out our congestion scorecard just a couple of months back, looking at across 50 countries and 1,000+ cities, what's the current state of play when it comes to congestion. What we've seen is that across the board, congestion is still really down on all roads. And it's particularly down in cities. We've seen a rebound from the kind of early days of COVID, where we all remember empty streets and really quick travel times. We've seen that congestion come back. We haven't necessarily seen it come back everywhere. And that's where this sort of data can be very helpful. So in US cities, we've actually seen downtown travel be much slower to return to normal pre-pandemic levels than our friends in the UK or in Germany. And the change is really dramatic across different cities. So, I've got a couple of stats up here. So for Boston versus 2019, we saw that sort of delay still. So how quickly vehicles are traveling, still 47% lower than we had seen pre-pandemic. Versus a city like Miami, where returned, but still down about 20%. This sort of information, I think, is really helpful, particularly in a more timely fashion, to help cities change their plans, update, understand how the road network's being used, and be able to respond accordingly. We've seen that morning commutes are still way down, evening commutes are still up. What does that mean, and how does that let a city respond accordingly to the sorts of, whether it's new mobility options, changes to road design, or changes to incentives about what mobility options their constituents are using. Kind of that part we leave up to our customers, but we can provide them data to help make those smarter decisions and actually understand what's taking place on the roadway.
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating. And I think both what Sarah was talking about before about sort of using the right vehicle for a given job, and just sort of generally the opportunity that you're describing to sort of use data to get kind of more of that real-time feedback and really be able to pinpoint things. I think these sort of help give people a sense of what we mean when we say sort of the city as a system, and sort of the kinds of efficiency improvements that systems can sort of develop over time to just work better. And so, Greg, I wanted to turn to you. This is Partners for Automated Vehicle Education. We gotta, we have to make sure we're bringing in the autonomous vehicle angle, and and that's really a lot of the point of this conversation, is to sort of ask that question of where can AV start to try to help in this or fit into this sort of improvement of the city as a system. And I'm just curious, like, are there examples of places where you've seen urban development and city related issues that can actually be improved by autonomous mobility specifically?
Yeah, and thanks for the question, Ed. It is really great to be here with all you guys. We've all been really tremendous thought partners over the year on this exact question around AVs and the future of cities. And one thing I like to start with is saying that cities and innovation and transportation have always been very deeply intertwined. Innovations in how we move goods and people have played a really important historic role in enabling the growth and the vitality of cities. And there are always transition points where we look at what are the right tools for this job and these new challenges that we're facing. And we help to grow cities, and we achieve better vitality in cities when we find the right tools for those jobs. And I think a couple of great examples are the New York City subway system, or the railroads that connected agricultural products from the countryside into the cities. But to answer this specific question, I'll start by introducing Nuro for any who aren't familiar. So Nuro is building electric zero occupant autonomous vehicles for local delivery. And I'll show you our vehicle, the obligatory R2 show off. And so this is a zero occupant vehicle, electric, fully autonomous. And you notice there's no room inside for a passenger, allowing us to build a narrower, smaller vehicle that can transport goods a little more efficiently than, say, that vehicle with 5 seats that you don't exactly need all that space for. And so our mission is to connect consumers to things that they need, regardless whether they can afford or drive a car or not, by providing autonomous deliveries that are free or as close to free as possible for the consumer. And I think that exact solution kind of cuts straight to the heart of this question. As Sarah discussed, over the past century, we've really reshaped our cities around the car, and not just the car, but the personal automobile. And as a result, in too many communities, the case now is that in order to access jobs, in order to access education, in order to access food or other essentials, very often your car is the only ticket to do that. And to really understand this challenge, I like to point to food. This is the most important thing in all of our lives, right after air and water. And America and our challenges with hunger, even though we're a prosperous nation, I think are really provide a good lens for looking at how transportation and land use really play into each other. And so today, 20 million low-income Americans live in food deserts. These are areas without a supermarket nearby, and even controlling for income, more likely to be Black neighborhoods. People who live in these neighborhoods are less likely to own cars. And as a result, accessing fresh and healthy foods is just a tremendous challenge. And food deserts exist for a lot of different reasons. It's a result of land use decisions we've made, urban disinvestment, but transportation is a really big part of the challenges that we see here. And so I think we have, a lot of opportunities to look at land use and use new technologies to solve these problems. And on our end, on the transportation end, what we're looking at with Nuro is how we can use our vehicles to help improve access for those in food deserts. And so this is the exciting opportunity here. We did an analysis back in 2020, which found that delivery EVs can help to improve access for 70% of those people living in food deserts. That's 14 million Americans who will have access to fresh food out of the 20 million in that population. And so that's how I think we need to think about AVs, is through this lens. How can we use AVs as an opportunity to improve access, improve personal mobility, and improve goods mobility, and use it in ways that weren't previously considered possible? And we can get into a lot of this on vehicle design and other matters further in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if you think about, vehicle, obviously developing autonomous vehicles is long, hard, difficult process, but in some ways, compared to completely redesigning, the built environment of a city, it gives you sort of, as Avery was sort of referring to, sort of those tactical, kind of faster moving opportunities to start to address some of those challenges. But Sarah, I mean, I think it's kind of fair to say that ultimately at the end of the day, sort of the built environment, it's slower to change, obviously, but it really kind of is sort of what this all ultimately sort of centers on. Can you just sort of share your perspective on that relationship between sort of, the sort of mobility and kind of driven interventions versus sort of the more that fundamental work of sort of really rebuilding the city?
Sure. So I think Greg brought up a great example of what I want to get into, which is that we have focused a lot on the design of vehicles, on the design of personal cars and freight vehicles, but we haven't really thought about them in context, in the urban context. And so how do they fit in? And so I think that the Nuro food access program is great. But when I talk about context, it's about the governance and the responsibility of cities to provide services for every resident, whether that person, regardless of their income, their physical abilities, their employment status, their parental status, whatever their needs are, they have to be met by local government. And so if we're going to introduce a new mode, or as we probably will introduce a new mode, we need to consider the kind of wraparound policy issues that are going to impact our cities. But I, for one, am a technology optimist, which I am glad to say, and so I continue to have faith in the subway. But beyond that, if we're introducing autonomous vehicles, we can really use this technology, we can harness it to service populations that have been underserved. So the food access program from Nuro is an excellent example. Other examples are serving people with disabilities who may have a lot of trouble on traditional mainstream public transportation because people may be visually impaired and so they're unable to drive, but if they have an autonomous vehicle that they're able to use, they will have more access. And in the United States, we have about 24% of Americans with some sort of disability, and this population has long been underserved. And so being able to provide mobility to this sector would open up a whole new world for many of them. And we could also provide shorter commutes, for example, by using data like what Avery was talking about. If we really harness that data, we can provide door-to-door service for areas where commutes were previously an hour long, and at off hours, because we know that lower income workers or shift workers tend to travel at off-peak hours, or what's traditionally off-peak. So I do think that using the technologies that the other panelists who are talking about, we can improve cities, but we need to collaborate on these efforts going forward.
Absolutely, and that is actually one of the topics of one of our upcoming panels. So I'm so glad you mentioned that. But Avery, I wanted to ask you to sort of maybe build on sort of what some of what Sarah was saying there, about, again, when you look at the data, sort of, are there lower hanging fruits for certain kinds of trips? There's a lot of talk now about, in addition to using the right tool for the trip, even having sort of trip markets. And so there's a lot more focus on that. Are there particular kinds of things, whether it's commuting or errands or, I don't know, that sort of seem like they might have the most opportunity for either development or autonomous technology related improvements or driven improvements?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the successful deployment of any new mode or any new technology, whether it's automated vehicles or other, having a goal for that deployment or application is key. And let's use maybe Greg's example was a really good one around it's 19 million, right, individuals who are in food deserts in the United States, close to 20 million. Like that stat helps to identify the problem. But if you don't know where those food deserts are, it's very challenging to actually address the problem. So identification of where are the opportunities for new modes to have an impact is going to be key, and it's not going to be the same in every city. It's not going to be the same in every part of the country. The needs of those in rural areas are different than potentially different than the needs of those in urban areas. So what we're kind of trying to help our partners in the public sector do is use the data available to identify where a problem or an opportunity exists. So let's maybe say there's lots of really short distance trips taking place between neighborhood X and work center Y, and using that information to be tactical with the response to it. Okay, if our goal is to reduce the number of personal vehicle trips, let's look for the instances, the corridors, the times of day, or the markets where those trips are the lowest hanging fruit, I think to use your term, to replace them with other modes. But you also then need to actually provide another mode, right? It's not enough to identify where these trips are taking place, single occupant, short distance trips. How are you going to meet their mobility needs with a new solution? And then I think what sometimes gets lost in this conversation is like, this needs to be a cycle. So you get to the end of testing a new mode or testing a deployment, understand what the impact was. So did you meet the intended objectives? And where were the unintended consequences of such a deployment? Because we know they're going to be there. If we're not measuring them, though, it's very hard to continue this cycle of improving mobility for the constituent groups that a local government is trying to serve. And we certainly believe that really only through good data can you make good decisions.
Yeah. And Greg, one of the reasons I want to have this conversation is because so oftentimes people think autonomous vehicles and they immediately leap to the assumption that like one specific outcome is sort of predetermined for autonomous vehicles. And really one of the things we want to do here is sort of open people's eyes to sort of the variety of possibilities. And I think that you only have to look at the Nuro R2 to kind of get that, like, oh, AVs don't have to be just one thing. And so I'm sort of curious if you could share maybe sort of what are some of the decisions around this technology, how to deploy it, how to develop, what the vehicle looks like, that kind of might be most important in tipping sort of the ultimate outcomes and the ultimate impact of this technology sort of in one direction or another.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to get in this. We have another hour to answer this, right?
If only.
Yeah. Well, you hit the nail on the head, Ed. The fact of the matter is that you might, if you base your assumptions on the Twitterati, it would seem that livable cities and autonomous vehicles are sometimes mutually exclusive. But I think that this misses the big opportunity that we get with AVs, and the fact that through AVs, and plus the right combination of good policymaking focused on human results and multimodal transportation planning, AVs can be a really tremendous tool for improving these outcomes. And to Sarah's point earlier, the personal automobile had a singular impact on cities because largely because it was a personal vehicle, because it was often single occupant. If you look at the average car in America, it has 1.5 occupants, even if it has 5 seats. It has 10 to 12 cup holders. and probably room to fit your skis in the back still. And so for a lot of trips, we're bringing a hammer when what we actually need is a screwdriver. And so, you know, when we look at how America's redesigned our cities around personal cars, I think what we'll see is that the prioritization of speed and throughput and parking caused a lot of other modes to be edged out. More cars meant we needed more room for parking. More parking meant that every house, every apartment, every store needed to be farther away from the other. And so car dependence was really one of the greatest terraforming projects we've ever seen on Earth. And it wasn't just a land use impact, it was a lifestyle mandate. It became mandatory household expense. And so if infrastructure is destiny, I would say that personal car dependence was a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so I think that's the lens through which we have to look at AV deployment. And so I'll offer up four cool tricks, I'll offer up 4 strategies rather, to co-develop livable cities and autonomous vehicles. And I think on the first is to embrace multimodal transportation at the federal, state, and local levels. I think that's just crucial, is that we build bike lanes, we build out sidewalks. In a lot of America, you don't have a sidewalk to use, and public transit, and adopting a safe systems approach that prioritizes the comfort and safety of all road users is really critical. And this is where I think AV companies can be really key partners. Nuro's been a really vocal supporter of allowing cities to set lower neighborhood speeds for safety, building active transportation infrastructure, and adopting Vision Zero and Complete Streets initiatives. And ultimately, what we've seen is that safer streets and more mobility options benefit everyone. Number 2 is deploy AVs on shared and electric platforms. And I think that's, you know, first of all, that's what the vast majority of AV companies are planning to do. And, you know, we were told in school that sharing is caring, which is true. But the secret here is that sharing isn't just a nice thing to do, it's a more efficient, more sustainable thing to do as well. And we also need to be through that lens, we also need to be thinking about how can we update policies to enable new form factors that will allow for more efficient forms of vehicles, that allow for shared robotaxis. And actually, Secretary Buttigieg said in the Yahoo Finance article this week that we're reaching a point where the policies haven't really kept pace with the technologies. And so a lot of our regulations need to start being updated. Things where we're requiring steering wheels or mirrors or things like that don't make a lot of sense in autonomous vehicles. And the third is to build communities, not just roadway capacity. If we're looking at how we can use our roads more efficiently with multimodal options, with shared AVs, that means less space wasted on parking. That means thriving neighborhoods, and that means opportunity to densify cities. And so this isn't an exhaustive list, but I think this is a good place to start. And some good principles to kind of be centering around as we're looking towards how to build livable, thriving cities in an autonomous future.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sarah, I want to give you the last word. And I think we may go a little bit over here, and I think it's well worth it to go a little bit over here, because I really want to make sure that you have a moment here to sort of share, because I don't see as much dialogue between sort of the AV community and sort of the urbanist community, as it's a little surprising to me. And I'm kind of curious, what are your thoughts in terms of like what the AV sector can do, whether it's in terms of attitudes or proposals or whatever, to really help kind of facilitate a little bit more of that dialogue?
That's a great question. And, I think Greg, the 4 points you brought up are fantastic. Your first point about the kind of built environment, it's one thing to build a great environment for multimodal transport, which I'm 100% behind, but what cities struggle with is actually maintaining it. So what I would love to see is an actual commitment from for a public-private partnership for ongoing commitments. We need great sidewalks, sure, but they need to be repaved every couple of years or so. And then who's going to be there to help with that? So what I would like to see is some real partnership. And what I've been trying to do here at NYU is develop a kind of safe space for the public and private sector to come together and discuss these things, because I agree with you, Ed, that the dialogue has not been as robust as it should be. And I think that we can come to develop principles together on guiding principles for collaborating on a wonderful built environment that is safe, sustainable, equitable, and can serve all types of users. I will throw a link in the chat on a project that I'm working on here at NYU, focusing on how AVs might be introduced to New York City from a policy perspective. You know, aside from the safety issues, which are number one, of course, you know, when they are coming, what do we need to think about in terms of data retention and archiving, job displacement, community engagement, accessibility, integration with public transit, all of these different factors that will deeply affect how New Yorkers move, and as well as people in other cities. But we need to start working together to make it a reasonable transition.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will, by the way, be sure to share that link also through our social media platform. So if you don't see it in the chat before this ends, don't worry, you can check us out on social media at PAVE Campaign on most platforms. I want to thank you all of our guests for joining this conversation. I'm sure we all feel like we wish we had, you know, about 2 or 3 times the time that we did, but we do try and keep things relatively concise here to make it available for everyone. But I think this is kind of the start of a conversation. Certainly the rest of this month we'll be addressing themes and topics similar to this one, and I certainly hope that this is a conversation that we can kind of continue on an ongoing basis. Because as Sarah said, I think all relationships, whether it's between an AV company and a city government or anything else, it really depends on a sort of commitment over time, right? A commitment to showing up over time. And I certainly hope that we're able to do that around this topic, because there's so much important stuff to discuss here. For the moment, however, I have to simply thank our guests for taking the time to be here today. Avery Ash from INRIX, thank you so much, Avery, for being here.
Absolutely.
Greg Rogers from Nuro. Greg, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And Sarah Kaufman from the Rudin Center for Transportation at NYU. Sarah, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And thank you to all of our attendees as well. We know you have busy schedules, and we really do appreciate you taking the time to join the conversations that we have here on our weekly virtual panel series. You can find recordings of this on YouTube. You can find clips and quotes of it on our social media platforms, social media accounts at PAVE Campaign on Twitter and LinkedIn. You can also find us here again next week when we will be discussing another sort of urban and city themed topic for next week's PAVE weekly virtual panel discussion. Thanks so much, and we hope to see you then.